Hello and welcome to the Green Horizon Summit at COP26. Our next panel is here to discuss how to build a carbon market that works. I'm Jake Spring. I'm a correspondent with Reuters news agency covering climate and environment in Brasilia, the capital of Brazil. I'm joined here today by Lord Nick Stern, who is chair of the Grantham Institute on Climate Change and the Environment, by Mikkel Larsen, the CEO of Climate Impact X, marketplace for carbon credits, and by Tariye Gbadegesin, who is co-chair of the Voluntary Carbon Markets Integrity Initiative. So we're here to discuss how to build a carbon market that works, which is really the trillion-dollar question here at COP26 as people are talking about Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, which will govern how carbon markets work, and they have 2 weeks to try to figure it out. I'll start with a question that's maybe a little bit remedial, and I'll ask the economist, Nick, if you could just maybe start by telling us why is it important to put a price on carbon in the first place?
Emitting carbon damages other people. And if you can emit carbon at no cost, at no penalty of any kind, price or otherwise, you will not take that damage into account in taking your decisions about whatever, how to heat your house or what car to drive. And that is then a market failure in the jargon of economists. Mm-hmm. The market is not giving the incentives that it should give for conserving resources, in this particular case, the atmosphere and concentrations in the atmosphere. So that's a market failure. And if you don't charge people for doing something that's very costly, then those costs will get incurred and the damage will happen. So a carbon price is designed, or the point of a carbon price is to correct that market failure. We should, though, recognize that A, that's not the only route to correcting the market failure. Standards, for example, can be very important. We regulated out the incandescent light bulb in Europe. Standards can be very important in tackling that market failure. But there are other market failures which are highly relevant. For example, research and development, the way capital markets work, the whole network systems of broadband and public transport and so on. The information market failures. People don't know what's in what they're buying. And huge market failure associated with air and water pollution. So we kill 5 to 10 million people a year from air pollution, much of it from burning fossil fuels. So carbon price, there to correct a market failure, very important part of the story. Not the only way of handling that one, but don't forget the other market failures as well.
Sure. And so the question is, how do we then go about doing that? And I think most of us are familiar with mandatory carbon markets, if we're familiar with any carbon markets. California, Europe, cap and trade systems. But now there's been the rise of voluntary carbon markets. So I wanted to ask Mikkel if you could just tell me a little bit about why do voluntary carbon markets need to exist, and what do they look like? A little bit about what they look like in their present form.
Well, it's a great question, and in many respects, they're certainly changing at this point in time. So why do they need to exist? It really comes back to the point about making sure that there's a market mechanism for solving some of the problems that we so far have not been able to do entirely with regulations, as Lord Stern was talking about. So when they work well, they essentially allow those countries who had the lowest abatement cost to use that for the benefit of everybody, in terms of making sure that you have a transferability of carbon credits. When I say that they're changing, it's because what we're about to see happening, in my view, is we're starting to see more and more of a convergence between the voluntary carbon market, which was obviously driven primarily or predominantly by companies trying to meet their targets for net zero, and importantly, making sure that they didn't do so as a displacement action for taking drastic measures to reduce their carbon. But what we're seeing now is, at least in some countries, and you were mentioning some of them, we're starting to see that an amount of voluntary carbon credit can be used in lieu of, say, a carbon tax. And that can either happen in a way that only local credits can be used, or it can be allowed where there's an international transferability. It's my belief that for this to really work and to really have the economics of scale, that you need that to be an international market. And again, so you need to be allowing credits to transfer from one country where the abatement costs are low to another country where the essential leases are higher. And there was an interesting study that was done recently where it suggested that by doing so, the overall abatement cost would be reduced by about $250 billion a year by, I think it was 2050. So it tells you something about the need to get this, but it also talks about the fact that for this to really truly be meaningful, those credits have to be the right type of credits, and I'm sure we're going to come back to that.
Sure, yeah, well, we'll get to that in just a moment, but I wanted to turn now to Tariye to ask her a little bit about accountability. I'm curious, I guess the first question of accountability is just, are these voluntary carbon markets actually working at all to reduce emissions, and how do we know that?
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me. And I think the reason that there's a lot of emphasis on voluntary carbon markets and the integrity of voluntary carbon markets is that historically it's been a very fragmented space with sort of not enough frameworks for integrity and quality and how that ties into overarching net zero ambition. And so our organization, the Voluntary Carbon Markets Integrity Initiative, is focused on supporting corporates, organizations with creating a framework for integrity, a framework for claims and how corporates can make claims about net zero using voluntary carbon markets. We think voluntary carbon markets are an incredible tool, especially as ambition to net zero continue to increase and to escalate. But at the same time, it's very important that the quality of these credits meet net zero ambition, but also support sustainable economic development for the countries, especially the developing countries involved.
So in terms of accountability, I mean, can we, just to follow up on that, can we trust companies to do this on our own, or do we need perhaps regulation, like Nick said? Oh, I think we might have lost Tariye. I think I'll go to Nick then. Yeah. Do you think that corporations can do this on their own, given bodies like the Voluntary Carbon Market Integrity Institute, or do governments also have a role in stepping in these markets?
I think we do need bodies that can form judgments, form ratings, if you like, of the quality of the credits which are being traded. I think it should be possible to set those up without governments. It's market regulation, which should be transparent. So those bodies, we should know who they are and how they're constituted and what they do. But I do think that the markets can set up, or people outside the markets can set up things like Tariye's organisation. We're going to have to work out the right way to do that, and people are going to have to come together and agree on the right way of doing that. But I think that's perfectly possible. And we have to, I just wanted to underline what Tariye said, and I think she's back with us now, but I want to underline what Tariye said about quality. There's quite a few dimensions to quality. There's clearly the credibility. Is this going to happen? And is it just smoke and mirrors? There's the development story, which Tariye rightly emphasized. There's biodiversity. There's resilience. There's whether or not the buyer See, a lot of those are on the supply side. What does it look like in the place when you're restoring degraded land? Is it really being restored? Should be good for development, should be good for biodiversity, and so on. So that's on the supply side that you can check. But there's some checking on the demand side too. Is the corporation that is purchasing those offsets on the market, is it really pushing very hard on its own emissions reductions? So there's some quality, if you like, on the demand side. And my own university, London School of Economics, we announced yesterday that we had already gone, the first university in the UK, to go carbon neutral. Now, to do that, because we're not all the way to taking out all our emissions, we're moving fast, but we're not all the way, we did buy some offsets. Our students, our staff, I myself would push and did push the LSE very hard. We didn't have to push very hard, it was an open door, to buy really good quality credits. And quality judged against the kind of criteria that Tariye was describing, I just described. So there will be pressure from shareholders, from customers, from employees. And I think also one would hope from the board itself of a company that wanted to buy high quality and was enabled to recognize high quality through institutions like the VCMI.
I guess I'll go back to Tariye since she's, I think we have her back now. Just to ask, I guess, a bit about the quality of these carbon credits, like Nick said. I mean, I'm a journalist. There have been stories about carbon offsets in a variety of publications that dig into them and find out they aren't quite what they promise to be. And it's unclear how pervasive or not that might be. What work still needs to be done to root these out? And do you think it is a major problem that there are projects that don't deliver on what they say they will deliver?
Sure. I think the first and sort of core principle underpinning voluntary carbon markets is that they should be additional and should not be used to replace reductions of GHG emissions from a corporate objective, and so I think what is very tricky is this concept of having a get out of jail card in respect of pollution, or sort of buying a right to pollute, and that is really not the objective of VCMs. Really, VCMs and the work we're doing is around ensuring that quality and integrity are tied not only to achieving net zero, but frankly going beyond your ambition, and really using voluntary carbon markets to go beyond emissions and to ensure that we are Paris aligned, or the organization is Paris aligned, and we have to be very careful that this is not used in any way for some sort of greenwashing, green branding, etc. But quality is in terms of quality, there's a what and there's a how. The what is the credit, and how the credit is used, claimed, and how how that credit aligns with the Paris objectives. The how ties to how it impacts sustainable development, how especially developing countries, rights holders like indigenous peoples, local communities, are integrated. Their needs, their requirements, their livelihoods are integrated as part of the design. It's about listening, but it's also about integrating livelihood into how these credits are used for nature. And I think that's a very delicate issue, because the nexus of capital, livelihoods, people, and environment is a very delicate one. And that is where, quality, it's sort of quality beyond the credit and into how human beings are affected and how sustainable development is achieved.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I guess connected to the quality issue, a question for Mikkel. I understand, at least in the United States, there's some supply and demand issues when it comes to carbon markets, that there is demand and potentially astronomical demand in the future for this, but the supply of high quality credits isn't necessarily there. So even though there's this huge demand, not great supply, the price, as I understand it, is not great that a farmer, for example, can get in the US to sequester carbon. So how do you correct that imbalance? How do you get that supply of high quality credits and the lots of them they will need to meet this demand, do you think?
Look, I think you're absolutely right. What we're seeing is a severe supply crunch in the short term here, and it's actually a result of companies being afraid of buying the wrong thing. So there's an enormous amount of demand looking for exactly the same type of credits. And as we probably know, it takes about a couple of years to get new supply on the line. So I'm thinking of the voluntary carbon market as a market that's trying to recover, right? And for that to happen, a lot of the things that Larsen has talked about was absolutely true. I tend to think of it as we need to regain trust in 4 important areas. 2 of them we talked about is trust in the quality of the product itself. And we can talk about the technicalities of that, and then there's a very important aspect of how do you make sure that these things are sustainable. And by that I simply mean that if you look at the evidence, it's normally not the more technical issues that makes a project fail. It's the fact that you haven't involved the right people in the process, and therefore there's no incentive to keep them there. So that's a trust in the product itself. Then there's a trust in the use of the product, which of course is equally important. And that's around, in my mind, very transparent disclosure to make sure. And you can mandate some of those disclosures, but it's an element of itself. But there's 2 important aspects as well, and it's a trust in execution of these things here. What we've seen in the past is we've seen an enormous failure in transacting with transparency, with clarity of where the money goes, and obviously making sure that there's a selection of these types of credits. And then finally, there's the trust in what I call the monitoring of aspects of this. We have to remember that when a carbon credit is issued, at that point in time, hopefully if this is a good project, the carbon was sequestered. But it's absolutely pointless if the carbon subsequently is released into the air from the burning of the trees, from the degradation of a mangrove, whatever the project may be. And that monitoring, I think we've under-focused on. And we can talk about the technologies that might be helpful to do that. But unless you have the whole gamut of all these 4 areas, you really will never regain the trust in the system that we're looking for. Now, specifically to the point about how do you scale the supply, I'm less concerned about it. If you asked me about a year ago, I would have seen, look, there's a lack of financing going into this area. But if you look over the last 6 months and see the amount of financing going in, it doesn't seem to me that finance is the immediate problem. It's about regaining the trust and making sure that we all know what quality looks like, because we talk about it as we have a uniform way of thinking about quality, but we clearly don't. And I give a lot of credit for the Task Force for Scaling the Voluntary Carbon Market is having a stab at trying to do just that.
Sure.
Could I add one thing to the quality, the quality story, and that's the distinction between reduction and removal. Now, a lot of these credits are to boost along the reduction somewhere else, which may be moving, but the idea is the carbon credit helps it along the way. Another part of the story, very important in my view, and many others, is removal. So removal means actually taking carbon out and restoring degraded land, forests, direct air capture. All of those are removal. And if we're really focusing on net zero, I think special emphasis on removal is particularly important. And I'd like to pick up on what Mikkel said on the centrality of this story to finance. The move to net zero around the world is in large measure driven by investment. We probably, by 2030, just take the emerging markets and developing countries, probably have to be investing a couple of $1 trillion more per annum than they otherwise would. Great investments, not great burdens here. Wonderful investments, they give you cities where you can move and breathe, and ecosystems which are robust and fruitful, and they give you lower costs and greater efficiency and good returns all round. But those investments need finance.
Absolutely.
And this is a flow which does not have a debt service obligation.
Yes.
And so much of the pressure now on developing countries is around their debt service, particularly after COVID. So this can make a real contribution to financing the investment, which will be the source of getting to net zero and of good development.
Absolutely.
So I think we should move on to maybe the central question of COP26, or one of the central questions, which is Article 6. And they've been wrangling over it for years, and these voluntary carbon markets have gone ahead without it being settled. I guess this is an open-ended question for any of you. What is the potential impact of Article 6 on these existing carbon markets that are already being set up?
Let me have a very quick go, but I'm sure Mikkel and Tariye will come in too. The issues around Article 6, which have been difficult, are double counting.
Yeah.
Is the place that's buying the offsets counting it in their emissions reductions, as well as the place in which it's bought, is that place counting it in its emissions reductions? And I think most people who would think sensibly about these things would want to avoid double counting. And that's been one part of the story. Another part has been the standards, what constitutes a good one. And that's what we've just been discussing here. And I think it would be important to get agreement in Article 6 about what constitutes quality, because it would be very good to get that aligned with the voluntary carbon markets. That's the second point, really. The third point is there are quite a lot of old clean development mechanism credits out there, and what do you do with those? So those are basically the outstanding issues. And I think most of us would want very much to have mechanisms to avoid the double counting and to have clear understandings of what quality means. That's exactly what we've just been discussing. And that, I think, would be very helpful in getting the voluntary carbon markets and the more formal Article 6 markets properly aligned.
Sure.
Maybe I had 2
I can
points.
also just pop in here.
Please.
Oh, thanks. I think just to underscore that is also partly why under the VCMI and a lot of the other organizations, the emphasis that VCMs should really go beyond objectives. It's a great tool, and there are some overlaps with NDC, meeting NDCs, and within the objective to meet NDCs, you encounter the double counting risk, of course. But that only underscores why the going beyond ambition, and how do you actually accelerate ambition and use VCM for acceleration is critical. Now, the other aspect of VCMs is really the link to non-state actors, and the fact that beyond a country's objectives, you also have corporate objectives and financial institutional objectives. And to meet net zero objectives as a corporate or a financial institution, a VCM can therefore provide an additional outlet. But the tie back to Article 6 is that a lot of the countries or regions that can actually produce a lot of these nature assets are in developing economies. And there's a tie-in of capital flows to developing economies, and there's a risk of overlap where the developing countries' NDC, their targets to meet their NDCs, and then their sort of developmental needs that could benefit from capital flows as a result of nature-based solutions. And so, while the voluntary carbon market space is supposed to go beyond ambitions or targets, it's supposed to be non-state actors, there will ultimately be tie-ins with sovereign, there will be tie-ins with local communities and how that ties to sovereign activity. And that's why there really is so much of a focus on quality, integrity, and ensuring that net zero objectives are met, and the risk of double counting and the risk of weakness in that system doesn't materialize.
Mikkel, would you like to
Yeah,
take
maybe
it
I
on as
just
well?
add a couple of points. Look, I think it's absolutely vital that we get Article 6 clarified for at least two reasons. First of all, as I mentioned before, I think it's actually helpful that we start to see a convergence of the mandatory and the voluntary market. It's good for demand, and therefore it's good for supply, and which is ultimately we want. We want the quality credits to come to market. And I think if you're going to look a few years ahead, we'll be talking a lot less about a voluntary market, and we'll be talking about a carbon market. And it will have all kinds of dimension about what qualifies in this country and that country. But coming back to my point before, let's hope it becomes international. But the second and more important and perhaps very obvious point is we just need the clarity. You know, is corresponding adjustment required? It might seem like a very technical point, and Larsen was talking about it before, but it's actually quite vital and it's holding back markets. So whether you are in one camp or another camp, maybe matters less as long as we know what is the outcome here. The only thing I would advocate for is whatever way we come out with these rules, let's not forget that part of this story here is to make sure that we find mechanisms. And carbon credit is not the only mechanism, but to transfer money from the global north to the global south to develop and preserve what we all want to be preserved, which is ultimately nature. I mean, when you start to look at the numbers of how fast these things are being lost, you can't help but want to see immediate actions.
Sure, sure. And I guess, I mean, you talk about certainty and how it would be good for the market to have this established so they know what to expect in the future. I mean, of the wide variety of possible outcomes on Article 6, is there a big risk of it disrupting this market, of going in a different direction than the voluntary carbon markets have been going in? Do you see it upsetting the market at all, potentially?
Again, I think the lack of clarity is the most upsetting outcome here, but you know, getting into some of the more detail here, I think what could be dangerous. So what I'm looking for is a full integration. If you look at what some of the studies suggest, is the difference in demand and therefore in supply is about 3 times. A fully dislocated market would see about a third of the demand of a fully integrated market. That's enormous. So we're talking the difference between 700 million and 2 gigaton. So a lot. But one of the things you could be concerned about is if we require corresponding adjustment with immediate effect. And you can understand why you would want that, and you can understand why countries would need to have this clear focus on what do I keep for my indices versus how much do I export. But if we require it immediately, my concern is that you'll have some suffering and hardship in the short term, because no registries are really well set up. We just saw that last week Nepal was one of the countries who did the first kind of what's called a letter of approval, basically meaning allowing the mechanism for which you can transfer these things. But countries are not set up to do that universally around the world. And if you mandate something too quickly, some really good quality projects will suffer, and that's not what we want. So we want to move there, but we want to move there with a pace where those countries who ultimately is supplying us into this will be able to follow up. So I think we are looking at a transition period for some of this being resolved.
So the certainty would outweigh any possible negatives of the disruption, potentially.
I mean, it's hard for me to speculate about what the outcome could be. So I'm sure there's a situation where I'd rather have the uncertainty, to be quite honest. If it's a complete clampdown and says that there can be no existence of carbon offsets in any shape or form, well, obviously that would be an outcome that I think would be very unhelpful for the world. But again, I think what is holding back a really strong demand is, again, the uncertainty.
And turn to Tariye. Talking to some former negotiators, there's this sentiment about Article 6 that no deal is better than a bad deal in terms of accountability. And I was just curious, approaching it from an integrity perspective, I mean, would you agree with that perspective? Do you think no deal here at COP26 on Article 6 is better than a bad deal that could potentially allow for more emissions by having too cheap of carbon credits or problems like that?
I think it's important that great care is taken, and that we're very measured in how we deal with Article 6 and the carbon credits, given how delicate this space is. I think the concept of, I don't think the concept of no deal as such should really be the focus, and it should really be more about ensuring that there is really inclusivity, that all the voices are listened to, and that great care and deliberateness is used for how the outcomes and the programs are finalized. I think one has to be very careful when nature and sort of humanity and people are involved. This is really not something that should be rushed. There's still some time yet. There's still another week left in COP, and I think there's still some spillover days. I mean, the reality is that we're running out of time globally. The carbon markets are sort of a crucial way for us to sort of reduce deforestation, address reductions, and sort of support developing economies to protect nature. And so it is a very critical issue for us, but it is very important that we use a very measured approach to ensure that we don't have to unwind, but rather it would be better to start slowly and get it right than to move too quickly and have to fix it later.
Sure. So now that we've talked about Article 6, we've only got a couple minutes left, but I thought I'd talk about something closer to my neck of the woods in Brazil, where I've been out to a few reforestation projects, and some of the biggest ones, they say, oh, we don't want to mess with carbon credits. It's really murky, and we just want to work with philanthropies, and it's easier to do it that way. People who want to do good without any market incentive. And I was just wondering if you see any ways to get developing countries like Brazil more involved in carbon markets, and is there still a lot of work to be done there?
Sure. I think the issue of a trust deficit has been mentioned in this panel, and we've talked about the trust deficit from a buyer standpoint and from the corporate standpoint. But there is also, as you rightfully mentioned, the trust deficit from countries and indigenous communities, and the sense that philanthropies or NGOs are a safer partner. I've spent my life working on hybrid capital and impact programs, and it is possible to have capital and finance for good. And the world is changing, where the idea of capital for purpose and capital and financial systems that are able to integrate environmental, social, and livelihood benefits, it can work together. But it tends to be a bit of a slower process. It involves a lot more stakeholders, and it involves innovation, and it involves sometimes blended finance. Mm-hmm. And there's a growing sort of world of blended finance. And so what I would say to those communities in Brazil and communities in where I'm from in Nigeria is that it's important to start somewhere, and that there are successful models for capital driving the growth of energy, infrastructure, and it can be applied to nature. But their concerns are valid. The risks are real, and but it doesn't mean that it is impossible. And that's what organizations like VCMI have been set up to do, is to be able to manage this very careful tightrope of where capital interplays with nature and with humanity.
It is a tightrope indeed. So unfortunately, I think we're running out of time. So I'd just like to finish by wrapping up by saying thank you to Lord Nick Stern, to Mikkel, and to you, Tariye. And again, I've been Jake Spring, a correspondent with Reuters in Brazil. And thank you for joining us at the Global Horizon Summit to discuss how to build better carbon markets. Thank you.